Alrighty, so to continue with our manifest destiny and its consequences in this time period of American history, we have to talk about in a very condensed version of what is referred to as the Great Plain Wars, the Great Native American Wars, um, and the kind of outdated colloquialism of the Great Plain Indian Wars. Um, this time period is one which kind of is over a period of history from the 1840s up through the 1870s, where the United States government, before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and after the Civil War, were constantly making treaties, renegotiating treaties, and fighting or taking part in conflict with the Great Plains Native Americans, and tied into the idea of manifest destiny, which again is the belief that the American people, and America itself, has a God-given destiny, a right to rule from sea to shining sea, and to accomplish this, they could do just about anything, and whatever the means. This is the idea. They had to fulfill this. This was their destiny to rule, and so to understand the Great Plain Native Americans, you have to understand that they are not just the people that are acted upon. They had their own unique culture, and they acted upon and actively resisted the American expansionism in a number of different ways. The culture of the the Great Plains Native Americans, was one of a nomadic people, especially after the introduction of the horses to America by the Spanish, or the reintroduction. There were horses in America before that had gone extinct, and this reintroduction of the Spanish horse had changed the culture of the grasslands and allowed for more mobility of the Native American peoples. And so they existed within the Great Plain region, which is from the Rockies to Missouri and even up through the Western California region. But generally, the Great Plains natives can be summarized into these kind of categories. So there are cultural differences, religious differences, language differences. This is kind of a general understanding of what to understand. That is that they were nomadic people, meaning they moved from place to place. They did not live in places for very long, apart from in the winter. And their primary reason for moving place to place is that their life was centered around buffalo hunting. Um, to hunt buffalo, which are these very massive beasts, they migrate from place to place. The natives would not be right on top of them, but would move and track them, as this was the main source of food, clothing, utensils. It was their primary resource to follow, along with obviously water and other various sources of food that grew along the grasslands of central United States. Now, again, the Great Plains regions as seen here, from Missouri up to the Rocky Mountains. These are depictions. This is an artist depiction of the Native American and hunting the buffalo, a bit over dramatized, and it has a very 19th century grandiose appeal to it. And this is the image of them. Now, the headdress and the feathers all differed. This is where the idea of the headdress comes from, is from the Central Native Americans, but it was also unique to different cultures and peoples. It was not universal that all of them had this style of clothing, this style of dress. But again, this is more of a generalization of how this is what they were and what's going to happen to them after the Great Plain Wars. And this is what they look like. Again, flat grassy lands. This is what they call Tornado Alley because of the weather. It's so flat and there's not many mountain ranges. You have the Rocky Mountains here and the Appalachian here. This is where a lot of cold air, warm air mix. So you can have very, very cold winters, but also very balmy, warm springs. And it's also where storms and constant rainfall. And this is a very ecologically um, oscillating region where it can oscillate between different things. And so for the Plains Native Americans, the buffalo wasn't the center of life for these people. So the Americans got interested in the West again. Firstly, it was through the gold rush in 1849, though it also backtracks to the Mexican American War, with the United States government under James K. Polk kind of stirs up a war, pretty much starts a war with Mexico. The Mexican government at the time period, the Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, in order to gain California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. in order to gain these new territories out west. And during this time period, you get what's called the California Gold Rush, which is the famous 49ers, the San Francisco 49ers, the UNCC 49ers. The 49er terminology is for the California Gold Rush, where everyone discovered gold in California and rushed out there to develop California as fast as they could. You also had the gold strike in Colorado during 1858. Just 9 years later, another rush on gold, and then the long term, what's going to lead to these conflicts is the Homestead Act of 1862, which again, the federal land grant where people of the age of 21, as long as they did not take arms up against the United States government in rebellion, as in fighting for the Confederate States, the rebellious Confederate States of America, they could take up land and 160 acres and farm it. And while this is all going on in the Homestead Act, you have the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad, or the finalizing of it in 1869 in Utah. And the creation of the railroads and the creation of the Homestead Act, what you have to do is that you have to gate off land and you have to build railroad tracks across land. And to do this, you have to get rid of any obstacles that might interfere with this. And the biggest obstacle is the buffalo, and this is long term what's going to lead to the destruction and cultural and pretty much a genocide of the Native Americans of the Great Plains. So the Native American wars were forced onto reservations during this time period, but they resisted. Again, the renegotiation of treaties forced them into these reservations, these big areas of land that they were going to force them to stay into, which is a big change to go from a nomadic society centered around buffalo to farmers, pretty much, and white farmers at that, which we'll get into with the kind of cultural, kind of like the destruction of the Native American culture on a broader sense. Famously, famously during the wars is this there's this great victory at the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana, where Lakota and Cheyenne defeat the cavalry under General George Armstrong Custer, 7th Cavalry Unit, and Custer is killed, and this is a great victory. Again, this is during this time when they're being forced onto reservations. By this time period, it's very much kind of almost the end of the Great Plains Native Americans, but now is really starting to speed up. This is one of the unintentional consequences of winning the Battle of Little Bighorn. What ends up happening is that because of the Native Americans win the Battle of Little Bighorn, the United States government starts taking the forcing of the treaties and the reservations much serious, and they ramp it up. They send out more army units and more troops go out there, and this very quickly kind of spins this resistance into a death spiral in many ways. The Sitting Bull is hunted through Canada, and resistance is officially ended at the Battle of Wounded Knee, though it's also known as the Massacre of Wounded Knee, where civilians, women, and children and men were massacred by the U.S. Army in 1890. And there's a famous book about it called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and it very much becomes the end of armed native resistance to the United States government at this time period. This is where we get to the destruction of Native American culture and the creation of a new American culture. As they were forced onto these reservations, the creation of what's called the Dawes Act of 1887, which was to break up communal reservation lands into 160-acre plots. Again, 160 acres is like the Homestead Act, and it was to transform the Native American from a warrior nomadic person or nomadic people. Hunter-gatherer society is the terminology that some students may understand from world history, to the idea of being a sedentary white farmer. And there's a book by Helen Hunt Jackson called A Century of Dishonor, which showed about how the Americans and the American government have mistreated and continued to mistreat the Native American peoples and reservations, even with a recently new movie that came out, which for the likes of me, I cannot remember right now, about the Native American tribes, reservations in Alaska. So, Alaska, Montana. And so the process of this is what we call assimilation, which is the plan where Native Americans give up traditional way of life and adopt white culture. Though again, assimilation is very much forced, enforced, rather than adopted over time as what you would may call what's called cultural dissemination. This is assimilation, meaning they are forced to adopt these new styles. So again, these are a picture of what Native American children now dress like, going from the clothing traditionally, the traditional clothing and garb of what you would wear apart on the Great Plains, is now very much reminiscent of a 19th century Victorian Anglo-American style of dress. And so this is where we kind of see the end of Manifest Destiny. So we begin this the West has been conquered, the natives have been pacified, quote unquote, i.e., they have been killed or assimilated and forced on the reservations. The resistance to the Americanization of the West has been broken, and that this was the American dream at the time period. This Manifest Destiny is the first massive kind of idea of the American dream, apart from, say, the Revolutionary period where Washington, Adams, and obviously Franklin, a lot of the founders came up with the idea that the American dream was to resist British and monarchical rule. This is now a very much a common man's American dream, which was Manifest Destiny. And so the big question to this is that where does the American dream go now that we have conquered American land? Meaning that now that the natives have been killed off and their culture has been dismantled and assimilated and forced to assimilate into American, the quote unquote what's considered American culture and society. This is now the question that leads on: what happens after this American dream? How does the American dream change? And we will continue that. We will continue that with our talk on Populist and the Populist